Beyond the Definition, Measuring Poverty in the United States by Harper, Sarah, and Megan. So for our thesis, we think that while we don't think there's one perfect way to measure poverty while respecting everyone's dignity that accounts for everything, overall, we feel that the supplemental poverty measure, in conjunction with the capabilities approach, addresses the most important resources and foundations of poverty.
Poverty can be defined in many different ways. For example, it can be seen through the meaning of simply not having enough. According to the Rector reading, the average American believes that poverty is associated with significant material hardship and deprivation. Through our research and own perceptions, we believe that although there are many suitable definitions of poverty, poverty most closely aligns with the household's basic needs not being met due to a lack of resources, meaning that the household struggles with resources more than most other people in society. We define a household in terms of number of individuals, thus a household could correspond to one individual or multiple individuals in this definition. In terms of resources, we define resources in terms of Nussbaum's 10 capabilities, with access to resources helping households achieve these capabilities. Through our research, we have analyzed multiple different poverty measures and their pros and cons in order to understand more closely what the best way to define and measure poverty is. The Extreme Poverty Measure, EPM, is a way to measure poverty most closely associated with poverty in extremely poor countries. We would not typically use this measure in the United States. The threshold for the EPM is a household living on less than $3 purchasing power parity per person per day. Approximately 10% of the world's population live in extreme poverty, with the EPM being most prevalently used in less developed countries. The EPM also accounts for resources in terms of cash and subsistence food, and does not take into account any other resources. Some limitations of the EPM approach include the fact that money doesn't necessarily define quality of life. Additionally, some households could be living right above the $3 per person per day threshold and still be living in extreme poverty. Thus, the EPM does not take into account in their measurement.
The official poverty measure is another way of measuring poverty. In the 1960s, Molly Orshansky determined that families spend around 1/3 of their income on food. The money used to buy the food can either be money given by the government or money earned through labor. By multiplying the amount of money spent on food by 3, the income threshold, or the official poverty measure, was created. The OPM is used in the US and only considers cash. More specifically, it only considers gross annual pre-tax income. It is not relative to other people's income, so it is considered an absolute measure of poverty. The OPM does adjust based on family size and composition, as well as inflation. According to the Measuring Poverty in the US video, after the OPM was discovered, the rate of poverty decreased and has stayed around 11 to 15% since then. The OPM gives a consistent way to measure poverty over time and determines the starting point for determining eligibility for social programs. The OPM has its flaws, as the cost of food has decreased while the cost of living has increased. Although the OPM does not include non-discretionary expenses of all people related by blood or law. It also leaves out non-cash benefits like SNAP and Medicaid, as well as tax credits, child care expenses, and medical expenses. Therefore, the OPM doesn't give an accurate way of defining poverty today. The SPM was created to correct for the OPM's flaws. The Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, is another approach to measuring poverty. Instead of simply looking at cash, the MPI measures if basic needs are met or not. It uses 3 different sections, which are health, education, and living standard, to measure poverty. There are 10 overall parts split among the 3 different sections. If someone is in poverty, or in other words, if resources are scarce, then at least one of the 3 sections is lacking. Although the US does not use the MPI because there is almost no poverty that the MPI measures in the US. According to Rector, about 70% of people who are in poverty can pay bills like medical expenses and mortgages and have a roof over their heads. In fact, Rector explains that most people who are in poverty are able to get the amenities that the general population can buy a dozen years later. The Relative Poverty Measure, or RPM, measures poverty by looking at cash income. The threshold for determining poverty by using the RPM is less than 50% of median income. For example, if the median income is an annual salary of $30,000, then the threshold for poverty would be any salary under $15,000. A con about the RPM is that it does not take into account people's debts or assets, so it does not give a very clear picture about poverty levels. The list of capabilities, specifically from Nussbaum, is a way to categorize and measure poverty. Although it is unclear how to numerically measure poverty from the list of capabilities, Nussbaum believes that the list of capabilities is a far better way to measure poverty than the GDP. One possibility behind the difficulty of measuring the list of capabilities is because each person has a different idea of his or her list of capabilities, so different lists can't be compared. The GDP gathers all aspects of life into one number, which is not an accurate image of poverty. If people have capabilities, it means that there is a set of what they can be and can do, but they don't necessarily have to carry out these actions. In other words, there are internal capabilities and external context of choice.
While all of those other measures do have their pros, we believe the supplemental poverty measure, or the SPM, in combination with the capabilities approach, is the best way to view poverty and measure it. The SPM adjusts for, includes non-cash and tax benefits, which allows us to see who truly has greater needs, not only basing it on pre-tax income. The Schreider article says that a main contribution of the SPM is that it allows us to estimate how including different resources and expenses affect the number of people in poverty and the poverty rate, therefore supporting that this is helpful. It also better accounts for household composition, adjusts for geographic housing costs, and subtracts necessary expenses, which all contribute to a more realistic picture of the poverty levels at that time. Medical expenses are another resource that is accounted for in the SPM, which helps to show the levels of elderly poverty rates better than measures that do not subtract medical expenses.
In comparison to other poverty measures, the SPM is the best way to measure poverty because it accounts for a wider variety of needs and resources than measures such as the OPM. The SPM also allows for unmarried family members, partners, unrelated children under the age of 15, and foster children under 22 to be included in the measure. Thus, the SPM accounts for more variation than the OPM does. As shown in the graph, the SPM tends to have a higher overall poverty rate than the OPM, caused primarily due to how the two rates are adjusted each year, with the SPM being higher due to its adjustments in cost of living and household composition.
We do acknowledge that there are some faults with the SPM because no measure meets all of the requirements to measure poverty perfectly. For example, the SPM is less useful than other measures for historical comparison because the data from it only goes back to 2009, whereas other measures like the official poverty measure go back much earlier, as seen in the graph. For what we are talking about, though, the past does not matter because we are interested in measuring poverty in current times. Another fault that could be brought up is that the data could be hard to interpret due to the fact that housing and geographic costs are adjusted into the measure. Even though it could be harder to do, that does not mean it's not worth it to get a better measure of what poverty levels are like in different areas. According to the Schreider article, these poverty thresholds used by the SPM account for a wider set of needs and geographic variation than the official poverty thresholds. While we do think SPM is the best way to measure poverty, we do agree with Rector's opinion that there still is no perfect way to measure poverty and that a new one should be created. He advises against a new relative poverty measure because he feels it would only measure income inequality, but we're not sure we agree with this part of his statement because many different aspects can be measured with relative poverty measures.
On the other hand, Rector's idea that poverty in America is overstated in comparison to other countries does not support our argument that the SPM and capabilities approach is the best way to measure poverty. By taking into account in-kind and cash assistance, the SPM helps bridge the gap in poverty rates through taking into account what assistance these households are receiving, thus making the SPM a more realistic measure. By taking into account government benefits in the SPM measure, Rector's argument and statistic that 92.5% of poor households assert that they always had enough to eat during the previous 4 months does not support the SPM. Essentially, Rector believes that poverty in the United States is overamplified and that measures such as the SPM are unrealistic and amplify the issue of poverty that he believes is not so much of a problem in the U.S. By taking into account in-kind cash benefits and assistance in the SPM, this further strays away from Rector's argument, as he believes using measures such as the SPM are inaccurate and lead to skewed views of poverty in the U.S. Similarly, Rector also believes that aid to Americans should be redistributed to those who are actually in need, and that the census reports and news outlets create a false notion of poverty in the U.S.
The list of capabilities in the SPM are similar because both change based on the family or individual. Each person could have a list of capabilities that makes him or her feel respected and included, and no one can have an incorrect list. The list of capabilities refers to quality of life and respecting the dignity of each person, while the SPM is an actual measure of how life is actually going for a family. We believe that the SPM is a tool to measure poverty is the most effective, while also taking the capabilities into account. The capabilities focus on strong quality of life, which is a nice addition to the statistics measured in the SPM in order to fully respect everyone's dignity.
To conclude, we think the supplemental poverty measure is the best way to measure poverty at this time, while also acknowledging the importance of Nussbaum's capabilities approach, but we still think there is no perfect measure and are not sure if there ever will be one.